Okay, this is Q&A. Yes.
Right. Since we don't have the korban pesach anymore, we have the Afikoman instead. Do we spread matzah crumbs outside the door instead of putting blood on the door?
First, I thought about Hansel and Gretel. You're spreading the things to be able to find their way home. No, we don't do that. The whole idea is that it was a korban, and if you think about it carefully, it was a korban. And what you do with a korban, with every one of them, is you sprinkle the blood on the altar. And here, there's no altar. So the idea is the house becomes the altar. And that takes you on to all sorts of associations and ideas. There is a source that actually says that angels came and took the blood and brought it to Jerusalem, to the place of the temple. But that says, okay, it's a sacrifice. So if it's a sacrifice, the blood has to go in the place where the blood goes for sacrifices. But where it literally goes in physical terms is on the entranceway to the house, on the inside. On the inside. We don't picture Kodesh Baruch Hu as looking at the house, and I wonder who lives there. Let me check and see if there's some blood on the door so I can tell whether it's a Jew or not. That's not our God, sorry. He knows beforehand who lives there. Anyway, that's the beginning of a long story. No, we don't do that with the matzah. Yeah. What else is on people's minds here? Yeah.
So during Rifa'enu, I've been thinking about you pray for generally other people, for Klal Yisrael, people that you have in mind, you have their full names, but it's also a time to pray for your own refuah.
Absolutely.
And sometimes, as far as how you balance it out, like getting yourself into a headspace where you want to focus on Klal Yisrael in general and people who are going through serious illnesses, and then kind of putting yours at the end seems like a natural way to approach it to approach it in a non-egocentric way. But I don't know, but it was getting me to start to think about to what degree, and God isn't someone who's going to say, I'm only going to give you one or the other, but it kind of just raises a larger question as far as, even though that it isn't a transactional relationship, to what degree should someone care about another Jew? Like, should someone be willing to give up their leg for someone else's refuah? Or does that go against Torah values?
It's a very good question. I think it has a lot of implications. I want to mention two things first, which are just like points on the graph to be met. Whatever curve you draw has to go through these 2 points. There's a very interesting statement which often people misunderstand. It says, someone who prays for someone else, he will be answered first. That's what it says. Now, if you pay careful attention, it doesn't say that he prays first for someone else, he'll be answered first. No, he prays for somebody else. He does. He'll be answered first. So it's not requiring that you put the prayers for yourself at the end of the list. It's not requiring that. It's only saying that if you include in your prayers for somebody else, then you'll be answered first. So it seems to be saying, no, there is no necessity to put other people before yourself. That's one thing. Here's another thing. Is again something from very deep from Rav Dessler. You should love your fellow Jew, not your neighbor. That's mistranslation. Reah is not a neighbor. You should love your fellow Jew as yourself. So now let's think. I'll think in just very literal and unimaginative terms. Is there a mitzvah to love yourself? To love yourself. Well, let's try this out. Imagine that I love myself 0. Now, along comes a verse, love your fellow Jew like yourself. Oh, I got that. Since I love myself 0, so I'll love him 0 also. That doesn't seem to be the right outcome. It's clear that saying that you should love your fellow Jew as yourself presupposes that you do love yourself. So it can't be a mistake to love yourself. That has to be part of your equipment. Rav Dessler has a whole long essay where he takes this with utter literalness. He says, it's like you're not loving the fellow Jew equal to yourself, though that's included, but you're using your self-love to love him with. The self-love is the means by which and you effect love in the other. Now that sounds crazy because the self is not the other and so forth and so on. He has a whole long discussion of this. I'm not going to go into it now. It will take a couple of days. But there's no question that loving yourself is something which is taken for granted. Then there's a third point. The Gemara asks the following question. There's two people are in the desert and they're lost, and there's one canteen of water. One person has that canteen. He owns that canteen. If he keeps the water for himself, then the other one will die of thirst, and he will make it to civilization and survive. If they split the water, they will both die in the desert. What is he supposed to do with the water? So, Bar Kapra said, on the basis of certain considerations, he should split the water and they should both die. Because neither one is allowed to tolerate the death of the other. And on a certain basis, that's the right conclusion. Rabbi Kiva said, I have a verse, and that verse contradicts your conclusion. V'chei or chai achicha imoch, your friend, your brother, should live with you. That means to say, if you're alive and you could save his life, then you should save his life. But you don't give up your life for your brother. If it's 1-on-1 and you have the canteen, you drink it. You have no right to sacrifice your life for the other. So that's another data point on the spectrum. Now, we do encourage transplants. Usually the transplants of a kidney where a person can live with one kidney. So going further than that, I don't know. I don't know how you balance out danger of death. One thing you learn from that case is that with the starting point of Bar Kapra, that you split the water and both die, the idea of 5 hours of life versus 12 years of life doesn't play a role. It doesn't play a role. Only Rabbi Akiva says you don't have to give up your life for somebody else. But when you're calculating life, you don't say, well, if you had the choice between saving two people and one would live longer, one would live less, that wouldn't be the consideration. So I think that, now I'll give you a 20% answer to your question. What attitude ought you to have about these things? The attitude that you ought to have is, I care about and I'm responsible for other people the way I'm responsible for myself. What to do about that? The Kodesh Baruch Hu has to tell me. He has to give me rules. Just using my sentiment is not going to tell me in detail what to do and when to do it. There is a difference of opinion among the commentators, Rambam versus Tosfos, that let's say enemies surround the city, and they say that unless you give us a Jew to kill, so then we're going to kill everybody. So if you have to choose who the Jew is, then you mustn't, and everybody has to die. If they specify who it is, that's machlokes, and the Rabbi says you can't even do that. But what about a person volunteering? Listen, this is a terrible situation. We don't know what the outcome will be. I'll volunteer to go out and be killed so as to save the city. And on that, there's a difference of opinion. Tosfos says yes, and the Rambam says no. So there would be a place to analyze and look at the various explanations for the two opinions to get some feeling for how the dynamics goes. But it's a highly discussed situation, and as I said, the bottom line is you can't calibrate your feelings in such a way that you'll get the right outcome in practical terms. You develop the feeling because that's the kind of feeling you ought to have, but to know what to do in actual practical terms, you have to look at the rules, and the rules are complex. Yeah.
So we were going over the amount of wine you're supposed to drink for the Pesach Seder, and for one glass, and I think it was according to the Chaim Nah, it was 86 cubic centimeters, and the Chazon Ish said like 150 cubic centimeters. and those just happen to line up with the gematria of kos or kos, I think some other word.
Yeah.
And that has been bothering me since I've heard that, because how would the gematria of these words that have existed for 3,000 years line up just so with our modern measurements like that?
It's a good question, and of course, measurements are arbitrary. If you did it in ounces, you get different numbers. So it's a question of whether it's centimeters or ounces or whatever they use in India. You won't get the same numbers. So I don't see any significance in the numbers. If you give numerical values to the letters of the English language, God comes out to be 26. Just like the Yud Kei Vav Kei in Hebrew is 26. So okay, does that mean that English is really Hebrew or has Hebrew inspiration and so forth and so on? In any large body of data, there are going to be correlations that are spurious. They're not significant. In fact, a fellow from whom I've learned two things and despise much of what he wrote, Noam Chomsky, he said anybody who's run a laboratory knows that there are spurious correlations in the data. What do I mean by spurious? Well, they don't fit into any theory, and when you try to duplicate the set of the experiments, that doesn't turn up. So in your laboratory, with the kinds of things that you used and the approximate nature of your measurements and so forth and so on, you got this correlation. Okay, but it's an accident. It doesn't say anything significant. So I wouldn't make anything out of that. They certainly didn't use the number of the centiliters or milliliters, in deciding what and they didn't measure it that way. They didn't do it that way. Yeah, what's noch? Yeah.
So, I think part of this question could potentially just be answered by referring us to a source, but considering it's Rosh Chodesh, Yalav Yavo, we say a lot of things, a lot of terms that seem to be somewhat similar. So one that I'd be curious about specifically is the difference between Sason and Simcha. And I think we got into that on Purim, but maybe it's a refresher, or maybe it's different. But as a larger concept, like through davening, there's all these words that are often very similar. So Yishtabach, you have Netzach, Gedula, Vura, Tilav, Siveris, Kedusha, Malchus, and Kaddish, Yisbarach, Yishbach, Yisbarach, Yisrael, Yisneb, Yisrael, Yisrael, Yisrael. It's like, and I'm just struggling to find a way to even differentiate those words, like where to look to understand like what the unique connotation of each one is.
Well, I suppose a good place to look for the unique connotation would be in a good dictionary. There must be some fairly detailed Hebrew dictionaries which will work on the nuances of the words. Sasson and Simcha, I think we spoke about, the famous Gaon of Vilna on that. Simcha is something you plan for and you create all the conditions, and when you succeed in producing the situation that is desired, that brings about the Simcha. That's something you anticipate and you plan for and you, so to speak, make it happen. Sasson is something that's unexpected. It's a surprise. And the verse that's quoted in that connection is, Sas anochi alim rasecha kavotzi shal rav. I rejoice on your word as someone who finds a great treasure. Usually, people who find great treasures are not looking. That's not their business. Is looking for great treasures. It happens to them, and life has in it both types of enjoyments, both types of pleasures, things that you work on and you work to create, and so forth and so on. And as I always say to a new couple, marriage is like that. You got married because you had recommendations, and then you met, and then you interacted, and you felt that there's enough here to spend your lives together. But there will always be surprises. And some of them will be very delightful surprises. So that would be Sasson rather than Simcha. I think that makes a big difference, the way you look at life and the way you appreciate the things that happen in life. Some of the things are things which you at least have the illusion that you have control over them and that you build them and they fulfill your expectations. And other things which turn out very surprisingly. Very surprisingly. I know people who went through terrible, terrible stress. I know one person who thought he had an ideal job, and he moved his family to Israel, and they came in, and after a few months it went sour, and he went back to America, and then shortly after that he got sick. He spent 6 months in the hospital, and he told me he felt like he doesn't know what his life is. He doesn't know what's going on. And not too long after that, he got an opportunity to open a yeshiva in Eretz Israel, to be the head of that yeshiva, and he took it, and he's been here, that was 40 years ago, and he said, I couldn't have dreamt that this was around the corner. And of course, you may not know in detail why this had to precede it, but when you look like things are really going down, and then it turns out that way, so you say, really don't know much about what's going on. And I think that's a very deep message. We spoke about this with Megillas Esther. All these events take place, and the people who are living them really have no clue what's going on. Only later they could reflect backwards. He throws the party, he throws out Vashti, and then he gets a new queen, and it's over 1,000 girls he goes through before he decides to take Esther. And why is it Esther? And then Mordechai saves the king's life. None of this makes any sense until later, when everything's positioned so as to save the Jewish people. So one of the lessons that you get from that is that we really don't know what's going on. Now, I don't know if I told you this story about the circumcision where the child dies. I didn't tell you this story. So this is very important. I lived in Baltimore for 10 years before I came on Aliyah, 10 wonderful years. And there's a lot of families there who are graduates of Ner Yisrael and others who moved to Baltimore. At that time, they had many of them were working in Social Security, so that there was a minyan there, and they had shiurim there, and the United States government was very happy with them because, they're religious Jews, so you could count on them. One of them they all had big families. One of them had a child who was born with all sorts of problems and died. Why they sat Shiva, I don't know. Sometimes you wouldn't sit Shiva for that, but they did. And Rabbi Amram Tab, with whom we were very close, asked me to drive him there to be Menachem Ovel, to comfort them. So I did. And when we got there, he told the following story. He said, the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the one who took over the leadership of the budding Hasidic movement from the Baal Shem Tov, one day in the morning after davening, with his disciples still Talis and Tefillin on, said, get in the wagon. They got in the wagon and they drove for a few hours, and they came to a small collection of houses somewhere in the forest, and knocked on the door of one of the houses, and they found in there a Jewish family about to perform a bris milah. Okay, they're all alone. I guess they're with the moil, and here comes the Maggid with his disciples. They have a minyan. Wonderful. They perform the bris milah, and the mother takes the baby to another room, and they sit down to eat whatever food they had to eat. And after a while, there's a scream from the other room, and the mother comes out and says the baby has died. Imagine from rejoicing and singing to wailing and sobbing and crying. So the Maggid calls for order. He says, I have to tell you something. The Beis Yosef, Yosef Karo, the author of the basic Shulchan Aruch, when his soul came into the world, the baby was sickly. And because the baby was sickly, the baby did not have its bris milah on the 8th day. Now, the 8th day is very special. If you do it on the 8th day, you can even do it on Shabbos, even though you're shedding blood. If the child is sick and becomes healthy again, the first day that you can do it on Shabbos, you don't do it. You only violate Shabbos if it's on the 8th day. So doing it on the 8th day is very special, and he didn't have that. Great tzaddik. He created the basis of our halachic literature. I mean, it was gigantic. He died, and his soul is going up through levels in those worlds. It comes to a certain level and says, bang. That's it. No, you're not going any higher than this. From here on up, it's only for someone who had bris on the 8th day. Well, he didn't accept it. He didn't accept it. So they had a conference, so to speak. They said to him, listen, the rule is the rule. There's no way that you can violate the rule. You want to go higher? You have to go back and get it. That was the soul of your baby. Your baby had the soul of the Beis Yosef. And you were chosen to give the final perfection of that soul. So don't think that because your baby died that you did something wrong and you have to repent and God hates you and so forth and so on. On the contrary, you had a gigantic privilege of being used as the vehicle to give that soul its final perfection. And the proof of it is that we're here. They didn't come because of an SMS. They came because the Kodesh Baruch Hu inspired him to go to that place at that time and give them that message. So then Rabbi Taub said to the family, I want you to know that the death of this child, in no way should you take that in any way as an indication of any spiritual failures. I know you. You're wonderful people. There's nothing for you to fix and repair, and no terrible guilt that you have to worry about. You were chosen for a tikkun. You were chosen for a rectification of some soul, and that's what he told him. So I thought to myself afterwards, wow, if the Maggid had not come, that family never would have known. So what do we know? What do we know about what's happening to us and what we're doing? Maybe not a lot. We really don't understand what is going on. And by the way, I thought of something in this week's Parsha, what we read yesterday, that I didn't think of before. There were two types of weaving in the tabernacle. You have a cloth, and it was woven in such a way that on one side was a scene, something was depicted, and for the other side is just the other ends of the strings, which has no meaning whatsoever. So if you were presented the backside of the weaving, you would see just a meaningless, random jumble of colors. And you would know you're not seeing the picture because the picture's on the other side. But there was a type of weaving, which I can't even imagine, where you weave it and you get two pictures, one on each side, two different pictures. Here, it can be quite subtle. Someone shows you one side of the cloth, and you see the picture, and you say, okay, so now I know what the cloth is portraying, I know what it's showing, I know the reality that's being described. Then somebody says, but on the other side, there's a different picture. Really? I wonder what the relationship is between the two pictures. I wonder if maybe one picture isn't quite true, and the other is true. Maybe the first one hides the truth, and the second one reveals the truth. Maybe the one's superficial, and the other is deeper. But it's much harder to do that because you're seeing a picture. You're seeing and understanding a picture. And you're being told, yeah, but that might not be the whole story, and it might not be the deepest story. There you have to be able to take a step back from what you see, and then to realize that there can be much more there than what you see. In fact, there's a wonderful book, I think it's called The Other Side of the Story, which is written by Rabbi Rebbetzin Samet about Lashon Hara, and it's about cases where things happened to people and they were disturbing when they happened, and the truth was so different from what they assumed, and there was no way for them to understand it. It's a book of caution. I remember one story that he told there. There was a woman who had a very close friend, and she happened to be walking in the street one day and sees the friend coming towards her, and she anticipates saying hello and chatting for a little bit, and the other one just walks past her. She thinks, what happened? She just walked past me. Did I do something wrong? Did I forget to invite her to a simcha? Did I insult her somehow? She can't think of anything. I said, but she walked right past me. So, I don't know, something's wrong. And if that's the way she feels, so then, that's it. Goodbye. And some weeks go by, and she just lives with this disconnect from her friend. Then, going down the street, she sees a friend coming towards her, and the friend comes over to her and says, oh, I haven't seen you in so long, and how are you doing, and everything else. She looks at her. Wait a minute. 5 weeks ago, I saw you on the street, and you just walked right past me, and you didn't say hello or anything. What's going on? She said, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. And she was thinking, oh, yes, you did. I remember I saw you. And then she said, I remember 5 weeks ago, I had a visit from my identical twin. Oh, there's an identical twin walking down the street. It wasn't a friend. Could you have imagined that? She didn't tell us she had an identical twin. She didn't happen to know. Right? All that hurt, all that bad feeling was because she just didn't know the truth. They have a bunch of stories in there where these are all true stories. And so the bottom line is, when you realize things like this, you have to take a step back from, I was there, I saw it, I know. No, you don't know. You really don't know. You had this with eyewitness testimony for events that take place. I saw A murder B. Really? You did? What did you see? I saw A take out his gun, pull a trigger, and shoot a bullet into B, and B died. Ah, that's what you saw. And what was B doing before A pulled the trigger? What was B doing? I don't know. I was looking at A. Oh, really? Maybe he was pulling out a knife. Maybe he was shooting self-defense. Oh. I didn't think of that. Yeah, right. You didn't think of it. You can make a terrible mistake by not thinking about it. When you have a few experiences like that, you learn to take a step back and at least put in the question mark. Maybe I'm not getting it. Maybe I'm not getting it right. I'll tell you one more story about this, then we'll go on to the next question. The Taz was the son-in-law of the Bach, both great scholars. And those days, and even today in some places, the father-in-law agrees to support the son-in-law, at least for a certain period of time, so that he can learn. And sometimes they even write up a contract. And they did, and the contract said, one of the things said, that the father-in-law, the Bach, would provide the Taz with meat every day. Fine. One day, for whatever reason, the meat was, either it was lung or brain or something. Maybe there was a shortage, maybe a shipment didn't come in. It was really bad. It was tough. So, thereafter, the Taz took his father-in-law, the Bach, to a din Torah. You didn't fulfill the contract, and you owe me reparations. Well, some people, when they heard that, how small-minded and bitter can you be? Because one day you didn't get meat, and you take your father-in-law to a din Torah to accuse him and to convict him and to get payment? How can you do something like that? Well, as a matter of fact, the court found against the Taz, that his father-in-law didn't have to pay him reparations. Oh. And later on, the Taz says, I want you to understand what happened. I saw that in Shemayim, there was a critique against my father-in-law, that he didn't give me the right meat that day, for whatever reason. There was a critique against him, and he was in danger. And I knew I would lose in the earthly court. I knew that. And I also know that the heavenly court follows the decisions of the earthly court. So I went in order to lose, in order to protect him. Oh, golly. Didn't look like that. Right. But who told you to respect what looks to you? Who told you to follow what it looks to you? So this is a general proposition about how we should look at the world.
I can just do one quick follow-up as far as like the other words. Does Rabbi think you need to understand some level of Kabbalah to understand the difference in like the words?
I think that's right. Kabbalah definitely gives you the inner dimensions of the words, and the Kabbalah is quite subtle and complex and sophisticated and nuanced, but it definitely gives you a much better understanding of the words. But I would say you can start without that, like with Sason and Simcha. What I told you about that from the Gaon of Vilna is not Kabbalah. It's just, and it's enough to see that there's a substantial difference there. So, and sometimes the commentaries where these words are found in verses, sometimes the commentaries will explain the differences. So, by the way, there are a lot of books on prayer. So you could take out any of the books on prayer and see how far they go with it. There are a lot of books, a few books in English even, let alone in Hebrew. It's a lot.
But as a public service announcement, we shouldn't
I think that's right. There's a lot of works of Kabbalah in English, and people walk around with these ideas in their minds, and there's a double trouble here. First of all, like many things that you read when you're starting out, you don't understand them. But then, if I don't understand how to wash my fingers when I wash my hands is one thing. If I don't understand something or misunderstand something about divinity, that's a different thing. So, when somebody said, if your car's going 10 miles an hour and the wheel slips out of your hands, it goes 10 degrees, we'll make a big deal. But it's going 80 miles an hour, it'll be a big deal. So if you're talking about big things, I just tell you one little tiny one of this type. You'll read that the first thing that happened was tzimtzum, as if to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu contracted within himself and left space for other things to exist. And what you think of is, well, tables need space. If there's no space, there can't be any tables. So here's how you make it possible for tables to exist. Well, that's dead wrong. Dead wrong. And here's just an indication of it. When the contraction took place to leave space, the space was full, chock full. It wasn't empty. It was never empty. It just wasn't full of what it was full of before. It's called halal, and in modern Hebrew, halal means space. Yeah, so what? So if you make that mistake, and that's really on the headlines, so you realize that everything you read could be wrong, and you draw conclusions of it. Yes.
From a broad perspective, I understand that there are ethical considerations about mixing charity and justice. Are there similar ethical considerations that one should be aware of if going into business, of mixing business with charity as well?
I think so. I think it's a very good question. It's a very subtle question, mixing business with charity. And I think that although there may be general principles, they'll probably have to be fine-tuned for particular circumstances. I remember when I first came to Ohr Somayach, and it was a question of what they euphemistically call a salary. And I asked my Rabbi about it. He said, listen, you're being hired to do a job, and you're being paid a salary to do a job. That's a business thing. What you want to do with your charity, if you want to take your charity, give it to the yeshiva, you can do that. But doesn't stop you from negotiating a salary for the service that you're providing on a business basis. My father, told me a story about a very great singer named Caruso. This probably was in the 20s. And he was asked to sing at a charity event. And he said, my fee is $5,000. Now, this is in the 20s. So $5,000 is a gigantic amount of money. Of course, he was going to raise more money for them. And he took it, and then he gave it to the charity. And he was sending that message. If I'm paid for my professional services, that's what I'm paid for. If I want to do charity, then I will do charity this way. So I think it's important to keep the two separate conceptually. You can use your business as a way of doing charity, but then you count it off in a certain way. For example, providing services for nothing. Every good surgeon at times provides services for nothing because there are people who just can't pay. And he waives his fee. That's a gigantic service to perform. But yes, the two conceptually have to be kept separate, and then you look at your overall responsibilities. After all, if you use your business resources to do charity, and you have investors, you have to check very carefully that you're not violating the trust of your investors who are paying you to turn a profit, right? In a certain sense, that's been the motive of the United States for the last 4 years. What happened to corporate America, which is now being blasted out of them, thank God. So I think it's a subtle and important question. Yeah. Yes.
Let's see. Does the Torah say anything about individuals having repeated misfortune on the same day every year?
It says it about the Jewish people.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, for example, I've just read this in the Gemara now, Daf Yomi. When they were in the desert and they had to spend an extra 40 years there, or 39 years there, until that generation died out, generation of men anyway. The women didn't have to die. What happened was this. All year long, people didn't die. And then on the 9th of Av, which was the ninth which they cried about what the report of the spies, they dug a mass grave, and they all lay down on the grave. And in the morning, those who survived got up, and those who died, it was typically the ones who were 60 years old that year who died, and they were buried. So it was every year on the 9th of Av, that's when the current 60-year-olds will die. So that definitely is a repeat. We have at the time of the summer, around Tisha B'Av, when we mourn the destruction of the temple, from the beginning of Av, for those 9 days, it's recommended not to go into difficult negotiations or chancy decisions or chancy deals and so on and so on, because the situation is not good for Jewish success. So definitely times have different effects on outcomes. Now, of course, it's not dictated by the time. It's a feature. It's a feature of the time. And then there are practical consequences for it. Yeah.
I was say that is there anything that one can do if they experience repeated misfortune?
I think the first thing you would have to do is go to a person who's competent to judge whether it is a real correlation, and that would be a question of statistics, and also whether the date has any significance. By the way, I remember a case where a certain city had a number of misfortunes, the city, and they went to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and asked him what to do. He said, first of all, check the statistics. In other words, you had, let's say, an 18-month period where the number of tragedies spread it out over 10 years or 20 years and see whether your average is different from others, or whether averages are made with bottlenecks and with sparse. It's not equally frequent all the time. So he was very hard-headed about checking the data to make sure that there's something to be dealt with. So I think that's the first thing to do. And I can't give you a rule, because there are many dimensions to this that I wouldn't, some of them which I'm not even aware. To go to somebody who knows, I would go to Rabbi first of all. And if he would answer, you could take it, and if maybe he'll send it to somebody else. Yeah.
Bit of a specific question, but in Musaf for Rosh Chodesh, in Elokeinu, I saw this sort of this interesting thing. So we say L'mechilas chet ve'lislichas avon, and then during a Jewish leap year through Adar Bays, you add in Ulachaparas Pasha. Does Rabbi have any idea why we add in that specific word, rebellious, willful sin, in that specific time period?
Well, it's very interesting. I can give you 2 points of reference here. During the rest of the year, in the Shemona Esrei, the third of the petitions, which is for forgiveness, mentions Slicha and Mechila only. And on Yom Kippur, Kapara is added. So there's a whole literature. Here it's close to what you said before, like what's Slicha, what's Mechila, how are they different, so on and so on. So you have an imitation to that here. On a regular year, you talk about Slicha Mechila, and then on a leap year, you put in Kaparas. That's the third. Slicha means forgiveness. Mechila means to be released from a debt. Mechila is a term from Jewish civil law. And the underlying concept, which again comes from the Gaon of Vilna, we talk about din v'cheshbon. By the way, if you're driving in this country and the policeman stops you and he gives you a doch, that's short for din v'cheshbon. What's the idea? Din means judgment, and cheshbon means calculation. So the Gaon of Vilna explained, when a person does something wrong, there's a double calculation of liability. Number one, what law was transgressed, and what significance does that have? And number two, what should you and could you have been doing instead of performing the violation, which is also a liability. Oh, the first one is objective. Here's what you did, and here's what the law says. The second one requires an evaluation. That's why it's called a calculation of what you could have been doing, and that means what positive thing that you sacrificed. So mechila is so when a person performs a transgression, there's usually both. There's what he did wrong, and there's also what he owes. Now, what he owes is because he used the Kodesh Baruch Hu's resources, including his own mind and his body and his money and all the rest, to do something wrong. So he owes for that. So mechila is being released from the indebtedness that's incurred by the transgression. Slicha is kishmo, that Kodesh Baruch Hu should forgive and not, so to speak, maintain a condemnation. Kapara is cleansing. And kapara is a third thing, which one has to describe with delicacy. I think the best way to describe it is this, that even if I know that Kodesh Baruch Hu is not going to ask me to pay back, with what shall I pay back? And he's not against me. His attitude isn't against me. But how can I live with myself and present myself to Kadosh Baruch Hu with the same comfort and familiarity and intimacy as I did before I did the transgression? The Rambam writes about this in Hilchos Tshuva. He says, person who's performed the transgression shouldn't think of himself as condemned and far from God and abandoned and so forth and so on. If he's done tshuva, he should know he's beloved and cared for and so forth and so on. But the very fact the Rambam has to write this is because it's not trivial for a person to feel that way. So the kapara would be cleansing me of the sense of inadequacy that's left over from the fact that I performed the transgressions that I performed. Now, then that means that this third thing, this kapara, is something which we don't ask for every day. We ask for Yom Kippur because Yom Kippur is the day of kapara. And here, since 7 out of 19 years are leap years, and you have an extra month, and this is the prayer for the new month, so the idea was to put it in less often, because like Yom Kippur is less often, but it's this ultimate completeness of overcoming the problems that were there. That's at least a point of reference for what you're asking. But if you ask other people, you'll get more than I have on it. Yeah, was noch?
Why is it that the psalms start differently or have the same repeated few beginnings?
Oh, that's a good question. There are different types of psalms. Especially poignant is Mizmor Shiur and Shiur Mizmor, where it's the same two words reversed. Now, Shiur in Hebrew often means poetry, just poetry. Sometimes it has a connotation of music, but sometimes it doesn't. Mizmor is music. And you have two different types of creations that have both poetry and music. Sometimes you have music that is composed for already existing poetry, and sometimes you have words that are put to music. That is to say, there's music and you put words to the music. So maybe that's the difference between Mizmor, Shiur, and Shiur Mizmor. But then you have other ones. Each one has a definition. Here, the commentators on the Psalms will give it to you right away, whether it's maskil or you have maskil, and you have Mizmor, Shiur, and I don't remember at the moment. By the way, I just saw something I must have read it before, but we have Mizmor Tefillah Moshe, prayer of Moshe, which is number 90 in the Tehilim. So first of all, even though it says the prayer of Moshe, there is some discussion as to whether Moshe wrote it or not. Because in it says, person's lifetime is 70 years, and if he reaches strength, 80 years, and Moses lived to 120 years. So Tosfos said it couldn't be that Moses wrote it. Couldn't be that Moses wrote it. But others say that Moses did write it. I saw in the Gemara, in the Parsha, Rashi refers to That the second one, 91, is one of the Mizmorim of Moshe. One of the 11 Mizmorim of Moshe, which means Rashi is saying it's going from 90 through 100. Somehow are all associated with Moshe. And the first one says Tehilim of Moshe, but the second one is also Moshe. So I don't know, I realized when I read that on Shabbos, in the Gemara, I didn't know what I was talking about. So it's just something to keep in mind. But yes, in fact, just like there are 10 authors of Psalms, King David edited the book. In addition to composing many of the Psalms, he also edited it. There are 9 other authors of various Psalms. How many different types of Mizmorim are there? I don't remember. But it's not hard to find lists and find descriptions of the different titles. Wouldn't be hard to do that. Yeah, what else is on people's mind?
Usually on his topic about Tehilim,
Yeah.
to what degree do we consider Tehilim, on what pedestal do we place it compared to, the Torah, compared to Nevi'im? When you go through Tehilim, it seems, you have, it's songs, it's poetry, it's difficult to, are you supposed to be medoctic in specific words?
Yeah, so first of all, the Tanakh is divided up into 3 sections. There's the 5 books of Moses, and then there are the prophets, and then the writings. The status of the second and third is a matter of some debate. Whether it's really prophecy or whether it's Ruach HaKodesh, which is a lower form of divine inspiration, whether the words were dictated by Kodesh Baruch Hu or were not. There is a difference of opinion about those things. But no one thinks that Shakespeare was inspired by God, but you pay attention to every word because he was a master of the language and he was a master craftsman. So you'll learn a great deal by studying the particular words. And so here you have someone who at least has divine inspiration, and he chooses these words. Yes, we pay attention to every word, and we analyze each word with precision and compare the words in different places. And I do want to mention one thing about Psalms, Tehilim, because I was misled about this for years. I thought of it as poetry, and I found that when I read them, even after I learned Hebrew, and I knew it to some extent, it left me cold. And I realized, I don't remember if somebody told me this, or I realized that myself, years later, poetry's job is to influence certain feelings, to generate certain feelings. Tehilim isn't like that. Tehilim is to give you words for feelings that you have. When King David talks about his fear of danger, when he talks about the tragedy of loss, reading the psalm is not supposed to make me feel the tragedy of loss. It might do that, and it might be positive to do it. I think it's more when a person suffers loss. He reads this psalm and finds that those words express how he's feeling, and then you think, and King David felt this way also. And that's a great, great comfort to know that the way you feel is a valid way to feel, because King David felt that way also. In fact, I thought of writing an article. I'm not a writer, so I don't, but I think a good topic for an article would be to just cull from Psalms verses where King David expresses either fear or anguish or despair, and there are such verses, and write them down, not in Hebrew, write them in an English paraphrase, and the way the article would go like this: I have someone I know, and this is a way that describes how he's feeling, and I feel terrible for him that he feels this way, and I'm worried about his belief system, because look at the kinds of feelings he expresses, which seem to be so out of place in Jewish thought and in Jewish values and so on, and I'm wondering what to do about him. So first let me share with you what he feels, and then I'll explain to you what I think about what we should do about it. And then just write a whole bunch of them, like 25 of them. people aren't aware of this. They don't read it that way. They don't feel it that way. I'm sure many will read it and say, oh, he feels that way. He thinks that. That's terrible. That's horrible. He's in danger of losing his soul and so forth and so on. And then say, by the way, these are all quotations from King David. And the message would be, it's normal to feel that way. It's normal to feel that way. I had a friend, a very simple person, and he once said to me, a tzaddik is always happy. He's always happy. Everything's always good. Everything's always up. I said, really? When Sarah said to Abraham, my anger is against you. Let Hashem judge between me and you what you did to me. That was an up day for her? That was a happy day for her? I don't think so. Didn't sound like it. And he didn't answer me. But absolutely not. When Jacob was mourning for Joseph and didn't have prophecy for 20 years because he didn't have the level of joy that's necessary for prophecy. So he wasn't joyful, not the way he was before. So and even though the Rambam criticized him for that, still, if I would be on the list of someone who had a weakness like Jacob, I'd be very happy. That would be the world's greatest success. So you have to realize that these feelings are normal feelings. They're natural feelings. That's something which I find that people often don't understand. Because they have too simplistic idea of what Jewish life is about. Okay, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll pick this up tomorrow.